Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on the fundamentals of economics. I am Grasilda from the Social Business Albania. This video is aimed at individuals who have no prior knowledge in economics and want to get a basic understanding of economics principles. What we will be going through in this video is an introduction as to what economics is, a history of economic thought, on the main principles of the two main branches of economics, which is macroeconomics and microeconomics, and finally we will be making a summary of what we have gone through during this tutorial. Let's move on to our first topic for today, which is what is economics. Economics is a social science that studies the efficient allocation of resources, which are capital, land, and labor, under the assumption that these resources are scarce. The two main branches of economics are macro and microeconomics. Macroeconomics is a study of the overall economy. The economy of the world, for example, of the continent, of the region, of a country, etc. And the topics that macroeconomics study are the macro indicators in the economy, such as the unemployment rate, a study of inflation, economic growth, and business cycles. If you do not know what these terms mean, do not worry, because we'll be explaining each one of them as we go through. Macroeconomics also studies the most important policies that are done by the government in order to maintain the health of the economy, such as the fiscal and monetary policies. In contrast, the macroeconomics branch of economics studies how individual consumers and producers make decisions. So, macroeconomics would include an analysis of how trade occurs between individuals, how price is determined in the market through the interaction of supply and demand, production and the costs involved in the production, how companies compete with each other, and other matters that relate to individuals rather than to the economy as a whole. Now let's move on to the history of economics. I have presented some slides on a timeline starting from the development of the first economics thought, which started in the 18th and 19th century. So first, let's go on to explain the birth of capitalism, or the classical school, which started in the 18th and 19th century. Capitalism is an economic and political system that is based on private ownership of factors of production, which are capital or money, land, and labor. According to capitalism, free market is the best way to go for an economy, with full competition and no state intervention. So no intervention from the government in the economy. The economy should be left to private players. The most important figure for capitalism, otherwise called the father of capitalism, is Adam Smith. Adam Smith is the author of Wealth of Nations, where he included most of his views on capitalism. He referred to the competition by the different players in the free market as an invisible hand which keeps the economy stable and orderly without the need for external designers. In this case, without the need for any state intervention whatsoever. Another important figure for capitalism is Thomas Malthus, who wrote an essay on principles of population. So he studied the effects of population on food supply. And he discovered that population growth, at the time of when his study was made, population growth is geometric, while food supply growth is arithmetic. So according to him, this gives rise to something that is called the Malthusian trap. So because population grows at a much higher rate than food growth, then poverty and starvation are inevitable. His study was conducted when the world population was only 9 million and the world population lived at a subsistence level. There were not much income and not much food, so the population of the world was trapped at very low numbers. However, it's quite debatable whether the Malthusian principles are relevant to the modern world, because now technology has advanced and the world population has grown to 7.3 billion. Lastly, one of the most important figures in economics, probably the most important one after Adam Smith, is David Ricardo, who studied international trade. He developed one of the most important theories in economics, in trade economics, the theory of comparative advantage, that explains the benefits of free international trade. According to David Ricardo, countries engage in mutually beneficial trade, so the trade between countries is beneficial, when each country specializes in producing and selling the goods and services that they can produce at a relatively lower cost than the other country. Let's move on to another school of thought, which is socialism, that arose during the 19th century. Socialism is an economic and political system which advocates that production, distribution, and exchange, or trade, should be regulated by the whole community, so shouldn't be in the hands of particular individuals. The most important figure for socialism is Karl Marx, which is the father of socialism and communism. And his theory, the theory of Marxism, is a theory of how society works, and it has got a quite anti-capitalism rhetoric. Karl Marx is an advocate of a society that is not separated in different classes, where the economic and political power is spread equally. So there are not very rich people and very poor people, but incomes are spread equally. And let's move on to the third most important school of thought in economics, which arose during the early and mid-20th century. This is Keynesian economics, or neoclassical economics, which is a continuation of the classical economics that we mentioned earlier. According to Keynesian economics, the active government intervention in the marketplace is what ensures economic growth and stability. So in contrast with the classical economics, the Keynesian economics also predicts that government should intervene in the market to fix market failures. The most important figure in Keynesianism is John Keynes, which is the otherwise called father of macroeconomics, and he authored the general theory of employment, interest, and money. This is his most important contribution to economics. According to his ideas, he promotes the government intervention to fix market failures through fiscal policy, which is through tax policies and other government policies, which are functions that are carried out by the Ministry of Finance in a country. Let's move on to the last school of thought, which is monetarism, that appeared later on in the late 20th century. According to this theory, this is the economic theory of controlling the supply of money in the economy through the function of central banks, rather than through fiscal policy as predicted by Keynesian economics. The most important figure in monetarism is Milton Friedman. He is also a very notable contributor in macroeconomics, and he wrote the quantity theory of money. According to Milton Friedman, In the free market economy, there should be a limited fiscal intervention, and he argued in favor of monetary policy through the function of central banks. We will be explaining what the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy is later on when we look at macroeconomics. So now we move on to the next slide, which is an introduction to macroeconomics and the main indicators in the economy. First of all, let's move on to explain gross domestic product and economic growth. Gross domestic product is the aggregate market value of all final goods and services produced in a country over a period which can be a year, a quarter, or a month. For example, the Albanian GDP as of today in 2017 is estimated at 11.4 billion US dollars. The GDP is calculated as the sum of total consumption in the country, total investment value, government spending, plus the value of exports minus the value of imports. Where exports are the goods and products that are produced in the country, they are sold abroad. That's why they contribute to our country, to the country we're calculating the GDP of, and we subtract imports because these are goods that are produced in some other country, and the proceeds of the sales in our country will be going to the country where these factors of productions were. Now, economic growth is period-on-period percentage change in GDP. Economic growth or GDP growth is calculated as the GDP in year 2 minus GDP in year 1 over GDP in year 1 times 100%. The annual economic growth in Albania was 4% for the whole year of 2016. Let's move to other concepts such as inflation and unemployment. Inflation is a sustained increase in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a time period. For example, Albanian inflation is 1.9% as of April 2017. What inflation does is it erodes the value of money, so it reduces the purchasing power of individuals. As you can see in the picture, for example, a $20 bill in 1998 was able to purchase many goods, whereas in 2013 it was only able to purchase only a fraction of those goods, which means that the higher the inflation, the lower will be the value of your money in terms of how much this money can buy. Another measure of the health of the economy is unemployment. Unemployment is calculated as the proportion of unemployed people out of those people that comprise the labor force. And the labor force includes only those people that are eligible and willing to work. So excluding children and excluding those individuals that are not willing to participate in the workforce. The Albanian unemployment rate as of the first quarter of 2017 is relatively high at 14.5%, for illustration. Let's move on to another concept in macroeconomics, which are business cycles. Business cycles signify fluctuations in the economic activity over a period of time. Business cycles are an integral part of any economy, and no economy can escape business cycles. As you can see in the graph, there's a trend which is upward sloping, and that means that the real GDP is growing over time. So an economy always grows over time as time goes by. And what we actually mean by real GDP is a calculation of the gross domestic product, which also takes into consideration, which excludes inflation. So these are, real GDP is calculated starting from a base year and excluding the effects of inflation in order to be consistent in the calculation of GDP. The economy goes through expansion and contraction periods. Expansion periods occur when the economy is growing in real terms. So the real GDP is growing. And this is evidenced by higher production levels, higher sales by companies, higher employment rate, better wages, and other indicators. Whereas a contraction occurs when economy experiences a recession. A recession is when an economy goes through 3 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. And recessions are measured by decreases in the macro indicators that we mentioned earlier. So during a recession, there is lower production by companies, therefore lower sales, higher unemployment rate, lower wages, etc. After we have explained some of the most important concepts in macroeconomics, let's move on to introduce the 2 main policies in macroeconomics to control and maintain the health of the economy, which are fiscal policy and monetary policy that we mentioned earlier. Fiscal policy is a policy that is performed by the Ministry of Finance. Through the Ministry of Finance, the government adjusts spending levels and tax rates to influence the nation's economy. Fiscal policy can be expansionary and contractionary. Expansionary fiscal policy includes, so first of all, expansionary fiscal policy happens when the government wants to fuel economic growth. And what it does in this case is it introduces tax cuts and increases government spending, or increases government spending. So what this means for the economy is that if there is a cut in tax for both consumers and businesses, this means that consumers will have more disposable income to spend, while companies will have more of their net profit available to reinvest. So in this case, there is increased spending and increased consumption in the economy. And as we saw previously in the calculation of GDP, consumption and investment are part of the calculation of GDP, therefore part of economic growth. So an expansionary fiscal policy leads to a direct increase in economic growth. On the other hand, there's contractionary fiscal policy, which involves the opposite. So there is the government introduces tax increases and or cuts in government spending on building of roads, railways, public health institutions, and the like. This policy, unlike the expansionary fiscal policy, is aimed at counteracting inflation. So when the inflation of a company increases a lot and increases beyond the target inflation rate that the economy has, or that the government has set, this will lead to the value of money being eroded and people feeling poorer. So what the government does, it increases taxes for both consumers and businesses, which would mean that consumers have less disposable income to spend and businesses have less money to reinvest in the economy. And because this reduces in a reduction in consumption and reduction in investment, this means that there is going to be less money supply in the economy. And when there is less money supply in the economy, the value of money increases. You can purchase more with that money, which means a reduction in inflation. And lastly, let's take a look at the importance of monetary policy. Monetary policy, unlike fiscal policy, relates to controlling the money supply in the market by targeting inflation or interest rates to ensure price stability. This function is performed by the central bank. For example, the Central Bank of Albania, its main reason for existing is to maintain price stability or to maintain inflation within the target range, which for Albania is 2 to 3% annual inflation rate. Monetary policy can also be expansionary and contractionary. Expansionary monetary policy is aimed at causing an increase in inflation. This is done by cutting base interest rates. Base interest rates is the interest rate at which banks, apart from the central bank, but secondary banks like Société Générale or Raiffeisen, is the rate at which they lend to each other overnight. And by cutting their base interest rate, this interest rate cut is going to be passed on to consumers. So there is going to be a cut in the general interest rates in the economy. This means that people will be able to borrow cheaply in the market. They're going to borrow loans for lower interest rates, which is going to increase the disposable income that they have, the disposable amount of money that they have in their hands. So this will lead to higher spending, higher money supply, so higher monetary base of money circulating in the economy. And the higher the amount of money circulating in the economy, the lower the value of the money will be. So this will lead to an increase in inflation. On the other hand, contractionary monetary policy is an increase, is aimed at reducing inflation. So for example, if inflation has overshooted to 4% and you want to take it down to 3% within the target, then you would have to increase base interest rates, which will lead to an increase in overall interest rates and will make it more expensive for people and firms to borrow. So this will lead to lower spending, lower money supply, therefore an increase in the value of money and reduce inflation. Now, after we're done with an introduction to macroeconomics, the main concepts and the main policies in macroeconomics, now we move on to the principles of microeconomics. That deals with how individual consumers and producers make decisions. In the first slide, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of supply and demand and equilibrium prices. So the aim here is to give an introduction as to how equilibrium prices are decided in a free market economy. As you can see in the graph, I have here the relationship between quantity of a product and its price, and I have drawn the demand and supply curves as well as the equilibrium price and quantity. First of all, let's move on to look at demand. The demand shows the relationship between the price and quantity demanded at each given price. The demand curve is negatively sloped because the less quantity is demanded as price increases. You are able or willing to buy less of a product given that the price of the product has increased, of course. And this is ceteris paribus ceteris paribus means when all other when everything else is kept constant. For example, we look at only the effect of changes in price to quantity, given that your income stays constant, your taste stays constant, the price of other products is constant. So everything else kept the same. This shows the demand curve is downward sloping. And if we take a look at the supply curve, this shows a relationship between the price and quantity supplied by producers or firms at each given price. The supply curve is positively sloped because the more expensive the product becomes in the market, so the higher the price of a product, the more the company or firm will be willing to produce because it will gain more from selling this product. This is also ceteris paribus, so keeping all else the same. Let's move on to the next slide when we explain the establishment of the market equilibrium price. The market equilibrium price will move to a level where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So the equilibrium price is determined by the interaction of demand and supply curves. And at equilibrium 1, we have price 1 and quantity 1. I've also included two other concepts, which are consumer surplus and producer surplus. As you can see along the demand curve, in the left of the equilibrium price, you will see that there are people that are willing to pay a higher price for a certain product. However, they are purchasing the product at the equilibrium price. So, consumer surplus represents the gains for those consumers who are willing to pay much more for a product, but they end up paying at P1. So, consumer surplus, as a definition, is the difference between the amount that consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. So, this is a gain for those people. On the other hand, a producer surplus is the difference between the amount a producer is willing to accept for offering a product and what they actually receive. If we look along the supply curve in the left of the equilibrium price, you will see that certain producers are willing to provide a product at a lower price than the equilibrium price. However, by them being able to sell their product at P1, they are gaining, and their gain is the area shaded in yellow, which represents their gains, so the producer surplus. Now let's move on to introduce changes in price and quantity as there are shifts in demand and shifts in supply. Shifts in demand are a response. So as you can see in the graph, there are shifts in the demand curve. These occur not when there are changes in the price of a good, but when there are changes to other than the price of the good. So the shifts represent responses to changes in factors that affect demand, except for the price of the good that we're selling. So these are changes in the price of related goods, changes in income, changes in taste of the individual, etc. So looking at concrete examples, a rightward shift in the demand curve from D1 to D2 implies that there has been an increase in the demand of the product, and this could have come as a result, for example, let's say that the product that we're looking at is Coca-Cola, and a substitute product that people could buy if they don't buy Coca-Cola is, for example, Pepsi. Now, if Pepsi increases their price, what will happen is people will buy less Pepsi and they will shift towards buying more Coca-Cola. And for us, this means an increase in demand that is represented by a shift in the demand curve from D1 to D2. And as you can see, the equilibrium moves from E1 to E2, which means higher quantity demanded and supplied by us, which leads to a higher price. So this is logical that when you're selling more of a product and there's more demand out there, you will ask a higher price for it. Otherwise, there can be a decrease in demand, which is represented by a leftward shift from D1 to D3. This increase in demand, for example, can come from a reduction in the overall income level in the economy, which means that there is lower demand for products overall in the economy and therefore a lower demand for our product. And the equilibrium will shift from E1 to E2. So the quantity demanded for our company now, for Coca-Cola, is at Q3, which is lower than the initial equilibrium at Q1. And the price will therefore be lower because there is lower demand in the market and the price of the product will fall. Now let's move on to shifts in supply. As you can see in the graph, now the demand curve remains constant while there are shifts in the supply curve. These shifts are a response to changes in factors that affect supply, which can be changes in production costs. For example, if the raw materials that you use to produce your product, let's say sugar in the case of Coca-Cola, if the price of the sugar increases, this will lead to it being more expensive to produce Coca-Cola, and that will lead to shifts in supply that will reduce our supply in that case. So let's look at an increase in supply, which is represented by rightwards shifts in the supply curve from S1 to S2. In this case, there is, of course, a reduction in production costs for us, so we are able to produce more, and the equilibrium moves from E1 to E2. So our quantity has increased from quantity 1 to quantity 2, which is also accompanied by a fall in the price because cuts in costs are transferred to the consumer by offering the product at a lower price. On the other hand, the move of the supply curve to S3, or the leftward shift, implies a fall in supply, which of course is as a result of an increase in production costs. The equilibrium moves from E1 to E3, and this means that our quantity supplied is reduced from Q1 to Q3, and the price increases to reflect increases in production costs. Now, after having explained the basics of microeconomics, the interaction of supply and demand, and the determination of equilibrium prices, I would like to move on to presenting the most important market structures that a market can take. The most important market structures in microeconomics are perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. To explain perfect competition, this is a hypothetical market structure which does not exist in reality. This insinuates an infinite number of consumers and producers where producers sell identical products. Because there is no product differentiation, the product is identical and there are so many people producing this product, these firms are all price takers, which means that no one of these firms is able to control market prices. So prices in the market are decided through the equilibrium price that we saw earlier, the interaction of supply and demand. as we move on to monopolistic competition, this is an imperfect competition market structure. There are still many producers in the market that sell products. However, there are less producers than in perfect competition, and these producers sell slightly differentiated products. In monopolistic competition, the barriers to entry, so for newcomers, new firms that want to sell this product in the market, it is quite easy for them to enter the market. That is what is meant by low barriers to entry in economics. And then let's move on to oligopolistic markets. This is a market structure in which a small number of firms dominate the market. For example, the supermarkets in the supermarket market is quite oligopolistic. Let's take in Albania, for example, the biggest markets are Big Market, Rossmann, Ana Market. So there are not many big markets out there. So they have concentrated power. They can greatly influence price and other market factors. Or let's take the mobile companies, for example, Vodafone, T-Mobile, Eagle Mobile. They are able to determine in the market how much they have a very great power in determining the prices in the market and the offers that they make to you as a consumer, because there is not much competition for them out there and you only have 3 operators to go to. Barriers to entry in the oligopolistic market are quite high. It's very difficult for another telephone company to enter the market, as the existing ones have a very high market share already. And lastly, let's move on to the monopolistic, to pure monopolies. This is a single producer selling a unique product in the market. There is no competition for this producer, so the barriers to entry are absolute. It is not possible for another company to join the market. For example, let's take the example of the transport company Shegatrans that is in charge of public transportation in Tirana. They are the only ones offering this service, so they are a monopoly, and it's impossible for another company to get involved in the public transport in Albania, or would be extremely difficult. So this is what I had in mind to present to you today, and I hope that it was all very informative. To make a summary, I would like to reintroduce what we went through today, which is, first of all, a definition of economics. That economics is a social science that studies the efficient allocation of resources, assuming that such resources are scarce. And the main branches of economics are macro and microeconomics, where macroeconomics is concerned with the wider economy indicators such as the GDP or gross domestic product, economic growth, inflation, unemployment, and business cycles. And the main policy tools in macroeconomics are fiscal and monetary policies. Whereas microeconomics studies the behavior and interaction of individual consumers and producers and how they make decisions. We also went through a brief history of the development of the economic thought, where the main ones are classical economics, socialism, Keynesian economics, and monetarism. So thank you very much for listening to this video. I will also be providing quite a number of resources where you can read more on the topics that we went through today. Hopefully this was helpful for you, and I will see you in next videos. Thank you.